So while I'm on the what if grind, I've decided to tackle a topic I'm sure has been on many people's minds since the first episode of House of the Dragon. This one event that seemingly shaped the story before it even began. For years, Viserys and his wife Aemma tried unsuccessfully for a male heir to the Iron Throne. Though the closest they would get to that during their marriage was Rhaenyra, a girl, and we all know how Westeros views women. Viserys was obsessed with the idea of a son. He had dreams about it, not knowing it was of a different child, and ultimately, when the time came, he killed his wife for it. He was given a son, and named him Baelon in honor of his deceased father, Baelon the Brave. But perhaps the name was cursed because, like his father, his son died unexpectedly mere hours after he was born. The heir for a day. But what if that wasn't the case? What if Viserys and Aemma's son lived and the heir for a day was here to stay? How would the story change? Baelon's death was probably one of the most important ones in the entire series, despite it happening so early on. His death caused a dispute about who should be heir between Daemon and Rhaenyra. It was his death that Daemon chose to mock, if we're going to believe what Otto's saying, and got him disinherited, which caused him to take Dragonstone and fight with Corlys on the Stepstones. It was his death, you could say, that drove Viserys to remarry and father the Green Bloodline. His death is why Rhaenyra was even considered as a possible heir to the Iron Throne in the first place. A lot of conflict starts with baby Baelon's death, so let's see how things go if he were still alive. We'll set the stage during episode 1. The heir's tourney is in full swing, and so is Queen Aemma's labor. Like in the original, there are complications and the king has to make a choice. Try to save the child or leave it with the gods and risk losing them both. He chooses to save the child, to save his son. Due to the severity of the procedure, Aemma dies, but the baby is saved. The Maester congratulates Viserys on his new child, and the king, still in disbelief and grieving the loss of his love, names him Baelon after his father, Baelon the Brave. Unlike in the original timeline, and as suggested in the title of the very video, Baelon the Babe survives. He doesn't die a few hours after his birth in this timeline, but just because he lives doesn't mean all is going to be well. The king has an heir, but he's also heavily grieving the loss of his wife and mother of his children. To add some tension and stress to the situation, Baelon is actually sick as well. Despite surviving his first day in the world, it's unclear if he'll be able to survive anymore. Infant mortality rate was actually pretty high in medieval eras. Game of Thrones is no different. King Viserys had 3 of his sons die in infancy. Aemma, Vizzy-T's late wife, also had her fair share of children prematurely dying.
I've lost one babe in the cradle, but 2 stillbirths and 2 pregnancies ended well before their term. That's 5 in twice as many years.
So Baelon being sick and at risk of potential death even after surviving a day or two actually isn't that far-fetched of an idea. Naturally, this brings up some concerns in the small council. If the king's heir dies, then who is going to take the Iron Throne? So we end up having a similar conversation like we did in canon, though this time things are a bit different with Baelon now being included in this discussion. Viserys doesn't take kindly to this though, much like in the original. It seems like people are planning around his son's death, and that's something he refuses to accept. He already lost his wife. He's not going to lose his son. He won't lose his son. The council tries to say they only want to prepare for the worst, but as mentioned before, Viserys is not having it. He has an outburst over this, saying that his son will live. He even recites the dream he had of Baelon sitting the Iron Throne with the Conqueror's crown. Though no one actually believes what he's saying, they just see it as the king hoping for the best. Either way, he shuts these arguments down and ends the council meeting. Otto goes back to his room and, like in canon, pushes Alicent to visit the king. While the king has an heir, it's unclear for how long since Baelon is sick, and even if he survives the sickness, his life could still be short-lived. Jaehaerys the Conciliator is a prime example of this, or at least his children are. Some died as infants, some as teenagers, and others in adulthood. Anything can happen, and even with sons, the royal line is still very vulnerable, so just because the king has a clear heir this time around, doesn't mean the future is certain. Jaehaerys' eldest son, Aemon, was heir to the Iron Throne, and when he died, he chose his son Baelon. Then when Baelon died, he held the Council of 101 to decide on the heir to the Iron Throne among his grandchildren. Anything can happen, and anyone can die at any time, especially in A Song of Ice and Fire. So it's always better to have an heir and a spare. This is pretty much Otto's logic, as well as some of the other council members, like Corlys. Just because Baelon lived doesn't mean Viserys shouldn't have any more children, but we'll get into that in a bit. Like in canon, Alicent visits Viserys, but this time he's not alone. He's with Baby B, who is crying up a storm at the moment because he's sick, and Viserys has difficulty calming him down. Alicent offers to help him and successfully manages to calm down baby Baelon. It may sound far-fetched given how Alicent interacts with her own children when they're babies, but we'll say this is different because this time she's doing it of her own free will. While Alicent does love her children in canon, she never wanted them, or at least not in the manner that she had them. This, I believe, is what caused her to have a disconnect with them when they were younger. She was a child who had to bear and raise other children, but in this timeline, she's not being forced to care for Baelon. In this moment, she just sees Viserys struggling and wants to help out. She's just being kind. She does still struggle, of course, because she knows nothing about babies, but her trying seems to be enough to calm down baby B, who is still sickly, mind you. This plants the seeds for her relationship with Viserys, or shall I say, his attachment to her. In this timeline, she's not just a friend, a comfort zone, or potential spouse. She's a potential mother for his son. But initially, Viserys does resist the idea of remarriage. But before we get into that, let's talk about some other things that would change if Baelon survived. One change that could end up being major is that with the survival of baby B, Daemon is never exiled. What gets Daemon booted out of King's Landing is him essentially mocking the death of the king's son.
The gods give just as the gods take away.
He toasted Prince Baelon,
To the king's son.
styling him the heir for a day.
In this timeline, with Baelon being alive for the foreseeable future, he is never disinherited because there's no joke for him to make about Baelon's death. I mean, if we still wanted to get him disinherited and exiled, we could say he makes a joke about Aemma instead, which would definitely provoke Viserys, but there doesn't seem to be much point in him doing that. The whole point of the heir for a day was him apparently celebrating his short-lived change in status as heir to the Iron Throne. He's not heir if Baelon is still alive, so the only thing they can really celebrate here is his birth. Regardless though, with Daemon not being disinherited, he has no reason to go to Dragonstone and hold it for 6 months. That whole act was just a ploy for him to get the attention of his big brother. Because this doesn't happen, he and Mysaria probably don't have that falling out like they do in the original when he says she's pregnant. He also doesn't steal the egg Rhaenyra picked for Baelon either for his imaginary child, so Baelon gets his cradle egg. So if Baelon lives, Daemon doesn't lose the favor of his big brother, and gets to stay in King's Landing a bit longer. Which means he may even be around to give advice to Viserys when he chooses to remarry. Before, it was just Otto. During this time, Daemon was still held up on Dragonstone away from court. So now, with him still here, it may not be as easy for Otto to sway the king towards his own daughter. Speaking of daughters, there's also Rhaenyra. Arguably, one of the most important things that happens with Baelon still alive is that Rhaenyra is never named heir to the Iron Throne. Briefly, she is considered, but it's only as a last resort if Baelon dies because he's sick. Even then, there's still Daemon, and with the birth of Baelon, the precedent of male preference primogeniture is even stronger than it was in canon. And when Viserys starts having other children, it's unlikely he'll ever choose Rhaenyra to be his heir, unless he changed his mind. In canon, it was more so a last resort. He disinherited Daemon, and Rhaenyra was pretty much his only option left unless he wanted to pass the throne to the Velaryons through Rhaenys. It was also a guilt thing too. He says he made her heir as a way to right his wrongs for killing Aemma, but with Baelon alive, the boy he's worked so hard to get, there's no reason for him to pick her. So Rhaenyra is just going to be princess unless Vizzy T changes his mind for whatever reason. But moving on. Time passes and baby B does end up recovering and becomes healthy. Viserys dotes and cares for him a lot, spoils him even, and that rubs Rhaenyra a certain way. She doesn't hate her little brother, but she holds a certain envy of him. All Rhaenyra ever wanted, like a lot of Viserys' family, was just to be acknowledged. With the survival of Baelon, she's never named heir. Viserys never pours into her the way he does in canon. It's honestly not that far-fetched because look at how he interacts with Alicent's children. They don't have much of a relationship. They don't even mourn him when he dies. And even when he is alive, he always prioritizes Rhaenyra over them, his heir. Even when his own son loses an eye, he interrogates and scolds him for spreading rumors he dispels every other day. Viserys is by no means a perfect man or a perfect parent, so the idea that he prioritized Baelon over Rhaenyra makes a lot of sense. After all, he's the heir, the future of the realm, the last gift left to him by his love Aemma. And honestly, I think it's possible he'll actually say this at some point, considering how he has 5 kids in canon, but refers to Rhaenyra as his only child.
My only child.
But granted, I'm fairly sure he had literal brain rot when that happened. But either way, Viserys makes it clear that Baelon is his main priority, and unintentionally pushes Rhaenyra to the side, which makes her jealous and vindictive to a certain degree. I wouldn't even be surprised if the two of them have an out about that, similar to what happens in the main show.
Because you mean to replace me with Alicent Hightower's son. The boy you always wanted.
One thing I'm sure of happening, though, is Daemon and Rhaenyra in this timeline do get a bit closer. As I said before, Daemon was never disinherited, and he never threw a tantrum to get his brother's attention. So during the next 6 months while Viserys is caught up with Baelon, Daemon is essentially her support pillar, who she goes to vent about things and complain. She does that with Alicent too, but Daemon is different. He can relate to her. Because Baelon survived, he's lost his position as heir to the Iron Throne. Like Rhaenyra, he's been pushed to the side. They find the attention that they lack in one another. It bonds them in a definitely family-friendly uncle and niece way. Totally. Either way, they want that recognition that they've lost. They want to be seen by Viserys. And once again, I have to say, like in previous videos, it's amazing how much of the main cast just wanted the attention and approval of King Viserys, and the drastic things they would do to get it. 6 months later, while Baelon is a healthy, thriving baby, the topic of remarriage finds its way to Viserys. Viserys resists the idea at first. He has his heir. He has his daughter. His brother is still alive, well, and in his good graces, so his family seems to be thriving somewhat. But he's reminded that things can change. Once again, going back to King Jaehaerys. The old king had 13 children, and none would ever outlive him. Even though the crown fell to his grandchild, imagine what could have happened to the Targaryen line if he only had 2 children and they all died, or ran off to Lys to run a brothel like his daughter Sarah Targaryen. Baelon could get sick and not recover. That happens to people all the time. Daemon could die in combat. Rhaenyra could fall off her horse and break her neck. You can never be too safe. Having an heir with a few spares is perfectly reasonable. So like in canon, Viserys begins searching for new brides. And of course, Laena and Alicent are the only real contenders here, though no one knows he's actually considering Alicent at this time. So like in canon, Viserys goes around looking for advice on what to do. Lionel tells him to marry Laena, Otto doesn't tell him to marry Alicent, just simply relates to his pain of having to choose a new wife. But an interesting new addition, though, is Daemon. Since he's not in exile and presumably still working as commander of the City Watch, he's around to help out Viserys. Even though they've been a bit distant with the birth of Baelon, they're still brothers, and that's not something you can just get around the corner. So the king opens up to his brother, unsure of what to do. He still omits that he's considering Alicent for a bride as well during this conversation. Daemon isn't exactly the best person to come to for marriage advice, in my opinion, since he's estranged from his wife Rhea, who he openly insults and cheats on when he feels like it. But despite his antics, he's at least honest about what he feels most of the time, and that's why Viserys ends up coming to him. Daemon essentially tells Viserys to do whatever he wants. He's the dragon. His word is truth and law. He could marry 10 women if he felt like it, even though the faith would try to crucify him if he tried. Or he doesn't have to marry anyone at all if he doesn't want to. But the choice is his and his alone to make, and whatever he decides, it should be something he doesn't regret. Daemon uses his failed marriage with Lady Rhea as an example. His marriage to her wasn't even his choice. It was a setup by his grandmother Alicent, and he hates every second of it. Viserys is king. No one can force him to do anything. So the dragon should do what it is he pleases. Now, as mentioned before, Daemon doesn't know, no one knows, that Viserys is considering Alicent. If he did, Daemon would have shut down the idea of Otto's spawn being near the throne. Not because he hates Alicent or anything, but because he hates her father. But because he doesn't know that, he can't speak on it. And the idea that he should just do whatever he pleases sticks in Viserys' head when he thinks about who to marry. And that isn't Laena. To him, Laena is just a child. Alicent is a woman, even though she is also a child, just being a few years older than Laena. Laena is 12 at this time, and Alicent is around 15 years old. Alicent has been keeping Viserys company for the past 6 months, and in these months, he's come to see her not just as a woman, but a potential mother for his son. He doesn't see something like that being possible with Laena, who still looks like and acts like a child in his eyes. So he makes the same choice he did in the original. Viserys also talks to Rhaenyra about his possible remarriage, and apologizes for being absent with her while he cared for Baelon. She does forgive him and ultimately understands that he has to remarry for the sake of the family. It's his duty, that's all. But she didn't know that included her best friend. So there's an outrage when Viserys makes his decision. Corlys feels slighted. Rhaenyra feels betrayed by the 2 people she loved the most. And Daemon, who is still present at the time, is absolutely furious about this. Because to him, this seems like an elaborate scheme made by Otto. It's the only explanation. Why else would he choose Alicent out of the blue when Laena was the only choice that seemed to be offered? He tries to persuade Viserys to reconsider and see Otto for what he is, but Viserys brings up how it was Daemon who told him to do as he pleased. Who is he to judge him for his decisions, especially when he doesn't even value his own wife? So now there's a bit of a rift in the family. Corlys resigns like in canon and goes to find the Stepstones. Daemon goes along with him as well since they both feel spurned by the king. Rhaenyra stays in the capital, and the story continues pretty much the same with the addition of Baelon. Aegon is still born, but this time he's the second son in this what if. Baelon is a year or two older than he is at this point. So if Aegon is about 2, Baelon is about 3 or 4 years old. You still have the hunt for the White Hart, like in canon, but it doesn't really carry the same weight like it did then. Before, it was like a contest between Aegon and Rhaenyra for who was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. But now, that whole plight doesn't exist. With Baelon's survival, Rhaenyra was never named heir. Male preference is still as strong as ever. If anything happened to Baelon, it's most likely that Aegon would be the heir to the throne, not Rhaenyra, unless Viserys had some change of heart, which is unlikely. Viserys had a dream that his son would sit the Iron Throne, and now he has 2 of them. While he is certain that the dream was about Baelon, if anything were to happen to him, chances are, given how obsessed he is over his dream, it's very likely that he'll start believing that the dream was about Aegon instead of Baelon. I mean, he does start questioning if he was wrong in choosing Rhaenyra once Aegon was born.
I thought Rhaenyra was the way out of my abyss of grief and regret. And naming her heir would begin to set things right.
Oh, it did.
I never imagined I would remarry. That I would have a son. What if I was wrong?
But with his dream seemingly coming true, it's very likely that he'll start believing that it has to be a son that takes the throne. Moving on, though, time passes and things go similarly to canon. Daemon returns to King's Landing, Helena has been born, and you have Rhaenyra sneak out into the city with Daemon. She still loses her virginity to Criston Cole, though, and Otto still reports this to Viserys, because no matter who the heir is in this timeline, it's not a good look for the princess to be seen in a brothel. Daemon is still exiled, and Rhaenyra is confronted by her father. Like in the original, she is still told to marry Sir Laenor Velaryon to help mend the rift between the families, but because in this timeline she's not heir to the Iron Throne, this means she will become the Lady of Driftmark, not the Lady of the Seven Kingdoms. Alicent also finds out about her sleeping with Criston Cole, but this time around, after finding out, her relationship with Rhaenyra doesn't go downhill, like it does in the show. The reason the relationship doesn't deteriorate like it does in the original is because of Baelon. In canon, Otto truly believes that a woman cannot sit the Iron Throne. Rhaenyra being named the heir was only a means to an end, a half measure in his eyes. He truly believed that with Alicent giving the king sons, their claims would always be stronger than Rhaenyra's, because that's how it's been for hundreds of years. And because of that, he truly believed that Rhaenyra would do anything to keep herself in power, even kill her siblings. But in this world, Rhaenyra was never made the heir. The succession was set from the very start. Male primogeniture is still as strong as ever. So there's no need for him to anticipate a rebellion from Rhaenyra, and he's not going to push for Aegon to be king either, because there's no point. Aegon is a second son, not the firstborn. And despite popular belief, Otto isn't a power-hungry lunatic. All of his actions have some form of logic to them, and I highly doubt trying to usurp Baelon wouldn't make any sense to him. Rhaenyra was one thing because she was a woman, and a woman has never sat the Iron Throne. In his eyes, conflict was unavoidable, but that doesn't need to be the case here. And if he wanted his blood on the throne, all he'd have to do is convince Viserys to wed Baelon to Helena, which honestly is very likely to happen since they're pretty close in age at this point. My point is, Otto has no reason to poison Alicent against Rhaenyra. He can't weaponize her fears and love of her children against her. So when she finds out, she's still very disappointed in Rhaenyra, but there is no declaration of war or bitter snide remarks in the future. So what does happen here? Well, Rhaenyra marries Laenor, Criston Cole has his mental break, and Joffrey still gets killed at the wedding, but this time Alicent doesn't save him. They don't bond over being wronged by Rhaenyra like they do in the original, and because she's not plotting to make Aegon king, he can't get his new lease on life. So he actually dies since no one can stop him from taking his own life. Fast forward 10 years, Baelon is a teenager now, around 15 years old, and still the undisputed heir. He's currently engaged to his sister, Helena Targaryen. Aegon is still a bit of a weirdo, but he doesn't grow up to be the same person he is in canon. Since Baelon is heir, he never has to deal with the societal and parental pressures placed on him at a young age. No more unwarranted expectations. He's allowed to just be, and as a result, he's somewhat of a better person this time around since he doesn't break from all the pressure being put on him. Aemon still wants a dragon, and Rhaenyra and Laenor still have Jacaerys, Viserys, and Joffrey. In this timeline, though, since Rhaenyra is going to be a Velaryon now, she actually lives on Driftmark, not in King's Landing. So this means Harwin Strong is not going to be the father of her children. Honestly, the father of her children doesn't really matter because they aren't in line to inherit the Iron Throne in this timeline, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll say that the father is one of Laenor's cousins, if not Laenor himself. And the story goes pretty much the same to a degree. There's a funeral at Driftmark for Lena after she dies during childbirth. Aemon still claims Vhagar, but he doesn't lose his eye in the fight this time. Since Rhaenyra's family has pretty much been on Driftmark most of their lives, he hasn't been bullied by any of them, and he hasn't had the idea of their bastardy drilled into his mind, so he has no insult in his arsenal worthy of a knife being pulled on him. And the kids aren't insecure enough to pull that knife over an insult, so it's just a fight between kids at this point. So when 6 years go by, there's no need for some long-standing rivalry between the families. Assuming Baelon has been raised right and he's a genuine person, we could see a peaceful transition of power when Viserys dies. Baelon, now a grown man with children and a dragon of his own, would take the crown and be called the first of his name, with all the support imaginable. And the House of the Dragon stands strong for another 100 years. Or at least until someone thinks the crown looks better on them instead. Either way, that's the video. Fairly straightforward, no real drama, and overall just peaceful altogether, unlike my last video with Rhaenys. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all next time.